So this second part of this 3-part episode series is when we really get into the nitty-gritty of trying to explain disorders from an evolutionary perspective. And this episode in particular is where we try and think about one of the major problems with trying to explain disorders versus trying to explain normal personality traits or normal healthy psychological variation. It's also a problem that psychiatry in general has recognized. You have to pick apart a lot of complexity. It's also a place where you might be making mistakes if you just kind of come into the field and you're thinking about this stuff from for the first time. There are mistakes that I made, there are mistakes that basically everyone makes, that you really have to kind of think through and get sorted in your mind. But I think it's interesting, and it's when you start really getting into like what are we trying to explain? What can we explain? What should we be looking at? So yes, I hope you enjoy it. This is like the beginning of the real, the substance of this paper, this framework, and these 3 episodes.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry Podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more.
And so what I've done in the paper is basically this very kind of strict step-by-step system to test any hypothesis, although you can do it in a very exaggerated, careful, drawn-out way, or you could really use it just to structure like your kind of intuitions and then run an experiment. There are various insights and contributions which had to add up to this method. And depending on what you're interested in, you can take from it what you will. I should also say that like most of this is not completely novel. Some of it is, but you can see dotted around both the philosophy of science and also the evolutionary psychology, psychiatry, and biology literature that many of these kind of insights have been separately arrived at, and people realize, oh yeah, this is a thing we can do, or this is what we know already. But no one had really added it up into a kind of from beginning to end, how do we pick this apart and justify our hypotheses? Okay. There's 5 steps. Originally there were 2, and then they became 5, and then the third one had to change. Anyway, this is irrelevant. But so it's called the DCIDE framework. So DCIDE. It's called the DCIDE framework. There are 5 steps. That you can really think about this in terms of 2 fundamental stages. The first one is really important for evolutionary psychiatry and medicine. If you want to explain disorder, you really, really do need to do the first step, which is DCI. So describe, categorize, and integrate is basically the way to work out when you're thinking about disorder, what are we really trying to explain? What should we be targeting with our explanation? Then the last 2 steps, depict and evaluate, are much more relevant for evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, but don't actually mean, if you're studying traits which aren't obviously disorders, you probably don't need to go through the first 3 steps. But okay, I'm interested in explaining disorders, and it's super messy. So you really have to tackle some of the problems which have been actually widely recognized in psychiatry generally, and have frankly stopped medicine being able to do anything. So I think if there's any element of the framework which is useful for medicine, it is these first 3 steps. And to some extent, it explains why we've been completely unable to actually find any, or make any coherent hypothesis for these complex mental disorders, but has ended up leading to useful neuroscientific or genetic explanations. And it's all just become messier and messier because people weren't using an evolutionary framework, and they also weren't doing a few of the things which you have to do if a trait has some sort of evolutionary explanation, and there's complexities here, we're just about to get into that, but if a trait has some sort of evolutionary explanation, but it's kind of a complicated one, then you'll be looking for something simple like a germ or a particular chemical that's been like overactivated, or like a tumor or whatever. We basically take simplistic, broken brain, germ theory inspired biomedicine, try and look for these simple causes. But if the thing that you're looking for is not caused by this sort of simple breakage, you're just never going to find it. You can spend as much time as you want, as much money as you want, tens of billions of dollars over the last however many decades. So decades of work, billions of dollars, it's not going to work, and it will never work if what you're looking for is some sort of complex offshoot of evolutionary processes. So the first thing that you really have to do, okay, in DCI, right, the DCI of decide, first 3 steps, how do you work out what you should be explaining? Now, one of these is very obvious, and everyone kind of knows about it and thinks about it. The other is much more nuanced, and it actually took me years to realize how important it was. But okay, so decide, the first step is just describing a trait. This is basically boring and normal. You just have to start by describing something, like working out what do you want to explain with an evolutionary framework. And yeah, so for something like autism, you describe autism as having this cluster of social and behavioral difficulties or disabilities or differences. And yeah, like this is just the first step for every science. Notably, of course, autism, what the autism diagnosis means has changed over time, over decades. The way that you fit someone as autistic can differ between individual patients, practitioners, also between countries, definitely between decades. So this is super messy, right? You start with these very crude clusters of individuals, some of whom are very severely disabled, some of whom have billions of dollars. So this is the first step. You just describe what you want to explain. It's obviously extremely messy, but that doesn't matter. That's just what. Okay, ideally you want to find something that is coherent, will be coherently explained with one evolutionary explanation. But for the purposes of the DCI framework, that actually doesn't really matter that much, because the whole point of the method is to try and take you through and remove some of these complexities which have actually been really troubling psychiatry and everyone kind of knows exists. Or at least, okay, the second stage, categorization, everyone kind of knows that you need to do this, which is basically separating out causes, like categorizing cases into those who definitely don't need an evolutionary explanation and definitely basically are diseases in the sort of traditional sense. And then taking these very simple, like unidentifiable, basically like pathologies, and realizing that even though you might have started with this broad autism criteria, you could have actually captured some people who have like very distinct pathologies, and then also captured another load of people who have something that is very definitely not obvious pathology, and we look for ages and we can't find it, etc. Okay, so your original description can be really messy and include these different types of causes. Categorization is the time to take those causes and separate them out. And how does it work? Well, basically, you have to use a fairly simple principle, which is asking whether or not a trait has been, whether there's a heritable component to it. So whether it has been inherited down the generations in some sense. This doesn't mean that like the parents exactly have to have the same type of autism which they've passed on to their kid who now has that same autism. Just so long as like there is some element of it which is inherited by the parents or inherited down the generations, that has been kind of reproductively successful. So, you know, if there's a kid with a quite more extreme autism and the parents both have autistic traits, and we can't find that there's any true disorder or like, true mutation which happens to cause that new form of autism, the kid's autism, then that's a heritable, inherited kind of trait tendency, which we need to explain through evolutionary theory. The fundamental insight here is, like, unless it's been inherited, or at least the tendency has been inherited, or the susceptibility has been inherited, then there's no need for an evolutionary explanation. If it has been inherited, then there could very well be an evolutionary explanation. And you can do this with various areas of evidence, which are basically what biomedicine does already. So in the paper, I point to a few main areas, but through neuroscience, through genetics, and through environmental causes. And each of these areas of like biomedical evidence you can use to look at a particular case of autism, for instance, and see, okay, this case is like definitely like kind of more classic pathology. So if you look at the brain, you can find syndromes like Rett syndrome, which have like very specific types of neuronal differences. And like clearly the parents don't have this like very kind of quite extreme pathological differences in neurons. You can look at those and say, okay, this is not inherited. Clearly this is a pathology. Other autistic people, you can look at their brain and it's like more complicated. There might be subtle differences, but you can't really work them out. It's not at this molecular level where it's like very obvious. Okay, so neuroscience, you can just, potentially look at someone's brain, see, oh, okay, they've got a tumor. Tumors aren't inherited. We don't need an evolutionary explanation for this case. So you can also exclude many cases with DNA. Genetics is this wonderful growing field. For the first time since the dawn of time, we are able to look inside the genome and pick out exact variants which might relate to certain types of traits. If you look at many disorders, you find that some of them are caused by what are called de novo mutations. So these are new mutations which arise in every generation. Everyone has about 70 of them. The thing is that sometimes these mutations are they arise in a part of the genome which is quite damaging. And often a de novo mutation will cause something that we categorize as autism, partly because just autism has this very broad diagnostic criteria. So it's quite easy to, if you randomly muck around with the genome in all sorts of ways and it causes some sort of problem, which then affects your brain, which often there are many genes which are expressed in the brain. So it's a pretty high likelihood. And then you can cause basically social and behavioral difficulties, which will fit into the autism criteria just because the autism criteria is so broad. So actually, most of the cases which you need to categorize as non-adaptive and not needing an evolutionary explanation for autism are caused by de novo mutations. And it really depends on who you're asking and how you're defining autism in the first place as to the estimate you might have of the amount of cases of autism which will be caused by de novo mutations specifically. And it varies between 5 and 20% in the literature. However, most of that literature is actually quite old, and that was before the massive increase in diagnosis. So that was probably around the times when autism was about 1.1 to 2% of the population. If you're saying that autism is about 3% of the population, the chances are is what you're doing is extending it into the more neurotypical or healthy population, and you'll have the same exact number of de novo mutations because you're always catching those cases. And there's a lot of people who now don't have those mutations and would be explained by these kind of subtle genetic variants, which are probably shared across a lot of the population. So what I'm saying is, like, depending on how you draw the line, maybe it's 5% of autistics who have a de novo mutation that's causing their autism. There's complexities here that we get into in the paper, but basically, some proportion of the case of autism, often the ones which are most intellectually disabling and co-occur with epilepsy and other physical health disorders, these are often caused by mutations. And there is no evolutionary explanation for why those mutations have persisted through the generations because they're not inherited. right? So just using this simple question of like, what's the cause? Was it inherited? It means you can kind of exclude these from from needing some kind of adaptive explanation. And then you can look at environmental factors. Environmental factors such as, for autism, fetal valproate syndrome. Valproate is a medicine commonly given to epileptic people, including women, but it shouldn't really be given to pregnant women. It's on the World Health Organization's essential medicines list, and it is quite effective. However, there's a not insubstantial chance of a fetus developing fetal valproate syndrome if they are born to a mother who is taking valproate. And often one of the symptoms of fetal valproate syndrome can be, or some part of the syndrome can be categorized as autistic as well, right? You can just use this autism diagnosis for lots of people who, Down syndrome can be categorized as autistic as well. Fetal alcohol syndrome might lead to a diagnosis of autism. Basically, there's a very broad term that can capture all of these different types of cases, and evolutionary explanations are really not necessary for some of these cases. So the point of categorization is that you're looking across this whole spectrum, and you can do this for schizophrenia or even normal traits like aggression, right? Like some people's aggression is caused by a brain tumor. When we're giving an evolutionary explanation of aggression, we don't need to think about the brain tumor cases. That's like a weird case that, is interesting, but can be excluded. So the point is that we kind of narrow down and remove these cases which everyone has realized for many decades that these need to be excluded. These have a different cause. They really don't need, you don't need to think about human ancestors having these traits and surviving and reproducing differently. But when there is a heritable component, then we do need to start asking those questions. So that's basically categorization. If you do categorize autism in this way, you find that the majority of the spectrum does actually kind of need an evolutionary explanation, or at least it seems to be related to something that's inherited. So there could at least be an evolutionary explanation. And you remove out the cases who are the most disabled often. So you've winnowed it down. You're like, okay, we want to explain this trait, but the trait was too broad originally when we described it. So now let's carry on with the cases which are not kind of simple pathologies. This, by the way, is the place when biomedicine current research is really actually quite successful. It's simple, reductionistic, single kind of breakage systems that you can find quite easily under microscopes or, with genetics. Okay, so that's really useful. Biomedicine can do that. People have already been talking about this in the autism literature and much of the evolutionary psychiatry literature. We know that these cases are kind of different, and they're often the most disabled. They're not paradoxical. Like, why do they persist through the generations? Well, they don't, so it doesn't matter. Okay, so first step, get that out of the way, and then we get to integration. Now, integration is possibly the most important, definitely the most sort of hard to wrap your head around. And if you naively come into thinking about mental disorder from an evolutionary perspective, you probably miss this step. This was the step that actually it took me years to realize like how much you really need to focus on it, because it is such a big problem. It's really messy, but it can be solved, somewhat easily. But it's definitely the thing, one of the major contributions of the paper, but also the benefits of an evolutionary framework for actually thinking about disorder in general, because this is where you kind of start to work out why we've been missing so much important evidence to explain these disorders, because we've basically been starting with these categories of autism. And okay, actually a lot of studies have been realizing that you don't need to take the person with Down syndrome and the person with fetal valproate syndrome and treat them as the same like autism that you're trying to explain. If you were doing a a brain scan, for instance, of autistic individuals, you would often exclude these cases who have known syndromes. Yeah, everyone kind of knows that bit. What they haven't thought about, and what we haven't really thought about enough, is this step of integration. So what is integration? Integration basically is about integrating the traits and the people and the states which go beyond the disorder category itself, but are fundamentally related to it. Okay, so here's the problem. If you take this initial cluster of whatever, 3% of the population who are autistic, you exclude 0.5% or 1%, or 10% of that group, whatever it is. You exclude the ones who you can categorize as having a true disease or pathology. And then you're left with this cluster, this 2% of people who don't have a pathology, and you think, okay, well, we should be trying to explain that with evolutionary principles, right? Now, this is the aim. Wrong. Well, no. Yes, but there's nuance here. Because the problem is almost all of these traits are related genetically, basically, to other traits which you might not be initially picking up. Like when you first started describing autism, when you started looking to try and understand it, you noticed this very clear distinction between the pathology and the non-pathology. What you didn't notice is there's a load of people you weren't capturing in that initial criteria who might actually be carrying the adaptive function either instead of or as well as these people. So, with autistic individuals, it might be the case that autistic traits which are distributed around the population sometimes manifest in this 1% of individuals who carry a load of the more extreme kind of costly basically expenses of an evolved trait. And actually in 5% of people or 10% of people who have borderline autistic traits, they're really benefiting. But for some reason, because it's randomness, genetics, environments, then 1% of people are being sort of harmed by it. Now, the complicated thing here is that you do need an adaptive explanation, but you don't need to be explaining that 1% of autistic people, even though they don't have a specific pathology, and you can't find anything that's biomedically obvious, they can still be caused by the adaptive spectrum, but not actually manifesting it themselves. This is basically because evolution works on a population-wide scale and also across people's lives. So to not take autism, to take something like anxiety, right, and a panic attack, you might think, okay, right, panic attacks are a thing, panic disorder is a thing. What we should be trying to do as evolutionists, evolutionary psychiatrists, is trying to explain panic disorder and these extreme states of panic. However, it's possible that this panic disorder that manifests occasionally in spurts for a certain period of someone's life is not actually where the adaptation is. Where the adaptation is that person just being quite neurotic in general and just a bit more hypersensitive to certain things and able and just more tuned in to whatever's slightly scary in the environment or something like that. And that could be where the adaptation is. And the panic disorder, which occasionally arose and then is gone, and there were a few panic attacks, and you're like, well, why did that happen? Should I be explaining that with an evolutionary perspective? No, probably not. That could just be a cost of the adaptive system going kind of awry in that individual for a little bit of time. Now, this, and I cannot emphasize enough how much I think this is one of the ways, the most critical way to basically solve psychiatry in general, but also to just go about thinking about symptoms and specific individual manifestations. because it's something that evolutionary psychiatry really struggles with, is like, okay, we have this amazing adaptive framework to understand how traits evolve, and it explains all biological variation, great. And it's kind of like functional. But there's all sorts of times when very obviously, like the thing is not functional, but it has all the kind of, it shows all the other, loads of other weird signs which imply it might be functional. And what we can do, and what people actually frankly have been doing for many years, depending on who they are, is try and explain the thing, the disorder, the extreme, the panic, rather than the neuroticism, or the most extreme type of autism, which is not actually pathological, or you can't find it to be pathological, but forgetting about the spectrum. This is, I think, basically the way to fix psychiatry in general. I know this sounds very grandiose, but this is really the main thing, and it's like a wonderful benefit of the evolutionary approach, that it does push us towards this more population-based thinking, and also over an individual lifespan kind of thinking. This will actually help us work out what's going on with each of these disorders, basically by thinking about the adaptation which might be going wrong in some way. And it's this weird middle ground of like, this isn't true disease. It's not just something breaking down. This is something that's quite functional probably in the majority of cases. Then actually this is a good thing to have. It's just that nothing evolved to be perfect. There are always going to be costs when evolution selects for a neurotic kind of personality type. It can come along with costs of randomly having panic attacks. And actually it doesn't really matter. Like at the end of the day, the general personality type could actually be really, really beneficial. So I think this is interesting also for the clinic, because it can help you realize that the evolutionary framing isn't just about reframing everything as itself positive. It's also about looking to the individual and saying, well, okay, look, you're having these panic attacks, are you kind of a somewhat, anxious individual? Let's just talk about what this system might be good for in general, right? Like being hyper aware about things. That's probably the thing that's happening is you just got this hyper awareness, but it's overactivating in this case. And what we need to do is just work out how to tune it down, right? I think probably most of the people, definitely who are at the extreme and who are being diagnosed, say, without really asking for it, and kind of 20 years ago when psychiatry was much more constrained, a lot of these cases will probably something to do with like adaptive systems that are kind of going awry, either in certain individuals or in certain times of life. Now, getting your head around this and realizing that the thing you should be trying to explain is probably not the disorder itself, but like the thing related to it, or the disorder but expanded to be a bit more inclusive of the actual thing, which is the biological trait which evolution acted on, is super important. And that is what integration, this third stage of the method, pushes you to do. Now, this was messy. When I realized this like how the extent of this and how much it really needed to be included, but I'd spent years kind of thinking about this stuff in various ways without really realizing how important this was. It was honestly a bit of a nightmare. I just started my PhD and I was writing up this stuff, and I just hit a couple of these giant problems that you realize will actually take you years to solve, and you'd have to like put off other plans. And anyway, but that's what it's all about. It's also fun. I find it fun. Okay, so how do you do this, right? How do you pick the trait which is where the adaptation might be? Now, your intuition, like the most obvious thing to do is to be like, okay, well, let's look for the places where there are strengths associated with whatever, the autistic person or the panic disorder or whatever, right? Like you have this person who seems to actually be suffering quite a lot in this particular instance. But actually what you need to do is work out like what's the adaptive, where could the strengths be around that trait or that person? Now, here's the thing, that's really messy. That's like scientifically and philosophically really messy, because you'll basically get into this problem of sort of storytelling again. We could spend, again, like forever running random experiments on family members, trying to find strengths and saying, oh, look, these family members have some strengths. This, the panic disorder people early in life when they're kids, they're like a little bit more cautious. So maybe it's because they're cautious as kids. But then, other people could find that, oh no, it's actually bad in these other individuals as well. And even the family members have costs, and actually being neurotic is also bad. You'll basically get into this endless random experimenting, finding good and bad. And there's no principle through which to really hone in on the traits which are of most importance to explain. However, there is a way. Thank you, Lord, there is a way. And it goes back to this principle that I was sort of talking about earlier in terms of standardized implications from certain areas of evidence. So this is where in integration we bring in something that are called like visibility variables. 5 areas of evidence where rather than it being just random psych experiments or other experiments to find strengths and weaknesses, there are certain facts you can look to which should have standardized implications for evolutionary history and which can lean into this concept of visibility to selection. So what is visibility to selection? It's something that has been widely kind of recognized, and even George Williams noted this in talking about what is called antagonistic pleiotropy, trying to explain why we age, basically. Pointing out that, okay, if you have a gene which makes you very, very youthful and vigorous and powerful and wonderful and amazing and intelligent when you're 20, but it causes you to degrade faster when you get to 60 or 70, actually it could be quite beneficial, because the thing that evolution cares about, the thing that evolution sees that is visible, the thing that natural selection sees, I should say, is this sort of earlier time. Basically because at the end of the day, everything matters about just like, did you reproduce or not? So the time that is visible to selection is earlier in life. And this concept of visibility to selection can be expanded in loads of ways that are really important and give us really useful, standardizable ways to systematically ask, well, what could this trait be for? Okay, well, the way to find out is to basically see what's its most visible correlates, right? In the same way that, okay, if you look at, we have 5 areas of evidence so that we go through. So prevalence, environmental factors, age of onset, duration, and sex differences. So I'll just kind of quickly run through. So the interesting, like these are areas of evidence which you can look at for every single trait that exists for a human, right? Like every single trait, whether it's eyes or jealousy or autism, there are facts about their prevalence, their age of onset, their duration, whether there are sex differences, and whether like they respond to the environment. These are facts you can ask about every single trait in existence for biological beings and come out with like these lovely standardized principles for working out where the visibility to selection is. So basically what we point out is the way to go about like identifying the adaptation. If you've got, the autistic person or the person with panic disorder, instead of just going around looking for strengths, you have to think about visibility. So for the panic disorder, you can run through each of these visibility variables and say, okay, well, where is it very visible to selection? And where does it have low visibility to selection? So this basically gives you an estimate of how likely it is that the function is there, that the adaptation is there. And this is basically just about empowering you to be expanding your lens to look at the right thing. to look at a very simple example of where you need to do this with disease to really understand why it exists, sickle cell disease exists in individuals who are homozygous for the sickle cell allele. I can't remember what the name is. It's got SL in it or something. But yes, basically, so there are, the way that like standard Mendelian genetics works is you inherit from both your parents, different size of the allele, and you can possibly get either two which match or one which is one way and one which is the other way. These are called heterozygous or homozygous alleles. Basically, everyone who has learned Mendelian genetics kind of knows about this form of genetics. Very simple, basically the simplest possible genetic mechanism of inheritance, and can lead to certain diseases when, for instance, sickle cell individuals inherit two copies of the sickle cell allele, and what manifests is this disease where basically they don't get enough oxygen in their blood or something like that. So this is like widely recognized. You know that this is very clearly a disease in certain individuals, and it's occurring in about like 1/4 of certain populations when they're reproducing. This can be quite mysterious, and you don't really know like what's going on. Why are so many of these people getting sick? If you were to just start by analyzing sickle cell disease and just constantly asking like, well, what's going on here? What's going on here? Okay, fine. You would find the sickle cell alleles, but you wouldn't really explain why they persist in the population, because you haven't been looking at the people without the disease, the heterozygotes, who have malaria protection. So if you look at the distribution of sickle cell, it's like almost exactly correlated with the places where there's loads of mosquitoes and loads of malaria. The thing that you really need to do is expand your original category, which was just focusing on the disease, expand it to try and look at the population who might not be exactly as affected or might be manifesting different traits. Because evolution doesn't care. Evolution couldn't work out a way to not prevent these people, these homozygotes, from developing the disease. And at a population level, it was actually beneficial if more people are kind of being protected from malaria, because malaria is so bad. Okay, so this is like a simple, obvious case where expanding your lens, basically, to zoom in or zoom out on the right trait literally gives you the evolutionary explanation for sickle cell disease. And you can do this with psychiatry as well, and we'll basically be able to explain any psychiatric trait. So I will propose. And the way you do it is by looking at visibility to selection. So if you were going through sickle cell disease with the DSI framework, you would start by identifying the disease, and then you would go through and you'd be like, well, is this inherited? And you'd say, well, yeah, there does seem to be this heritable factor. Then you'd come to integration and you'd say, well, okay, where's the visibility? Like how visible is this to selection? And can we increase the visibility? Can we look for the more visible correlates in the population? And if you did that, you would be like, okay, well, this is kind of, somewhat rare. It's only in whatever, 10, 20, 25% of people. Let's look at the wider population. And if you did that, you expanded the search, you would say, oh, okay, actually these people are protected from malaria. Here's the adaptation. And yeah, these are the sort of byproducts which are causing disease. Okay. So yeah, critical to do this. The various ways in which you can do this are by looking at these 5 areas of evidence. Age of onset is one. And I'll just kind of quickly run through with autism why you do or don't need to expand these criteria. So age of onset. If something is arising at like 50 or 60 or 70, it's basically not visible to selection. This, by the way, is why we age and disease at like that stage of life more than when we're earlier than like 30 or 40. Visible to selection is your early life until you've reproduced, and then basically your sort of like parenting years. But yeah, by the age of 50, on average, you'd be kind of expected to have kids and help them survive, and you're becoming less useful, essentially. Like, you've done the reproducing, evolution doesn't care anymore. If a trait is arising at 70 or 80 or whatever, the chances are it itself is not adaptive. Stuff like Alzheimer's and dementia, right? Like, it's so late in life that we don't really need an adaptive explanation. You might need an adaptive explanation for the traits which cause it later in life, but you just need to look earlier. So there's an allele called the ApoE4 allele, which causes early onset Alzheimer's and then also Alzheimer's risk in general. And I believe that if you look at what that allele's effects are, you find that there are some moderate effects to, I think it's intelligence. Like, it makes you slightly brighter earlier in life, but it also makes you develop Alzheimer's when you're 70 or 80. And from evolution's point of view, this allele can persist because the earlier effect justifies the later effect. Earlier effects are more important. Okay, with autism, the early effect, it is early. It's basically defined as arising really early in life. If autism arose at 40, then you'd have to start asking questions about, like, well, is there something going on earlier in life where we need to kind of start looking for a particular adaptation? In autism's case, it doesn't matter. It's already as early as can be, basically. Duration. So how long does an effect last of the particular trait you're looking at? Something like panic disorder, okay? Panic attack lasts however long, whatever. 5 minutes, maybe, it's a specific amount of time. You come out of it, can be very harrowing, but eventually, whatever. It was 5 minutes of life. Did it really matter? How visible is that? Now, in some cases, 5 minutes can actually save your life. So, it's possible that a lot of neuroticism is actually good just because of those few minutes of extreme fear, which actually save your life. But anyway, this is sort of a beside point. What really matters is the trait itself. Still, you want to be looking at the extended duration of any particular trait, with periods of depression. Say that you have 3 weeks of, quite severe depression. Maybe the adaptation is not there. Maybe it's like over a 5-year period when you're kind of dipping in and out of low mood and then not actually becoming depressed, you're reacting to that low mood in a way that's quite helpful. But then sometimes you just enter the state of depression. I'm not saying this is a good explanation of depression. I'm just giving you an example. Okay, so yeah, thinking about this, like the duration of something as well as its age of onset, obviously they interact. Something that happens for 20 years at the end of your life is much less important than something that happens for 5 years at the beginning of your life. But, still, okay. So yes, thinking about this visibility. Then you have sex differences. So it's entirely possible that a trait which arises often in males, or a disease that arises in males, for instance, like autism, it's entirely possible. Oh, sorry, I forgot to say, yeah, autism lasts for life, so you don't need to worry about duration. But okay, right, sex differences. If you have a trait which arises in males and it's inherited, you can have genes which are manifesting basically in different ways between men and women because of their hormonal background. But you could be noticing the problems in one gender, sex, without recognizing that actually the adaptation is in the other sex. So this is sometimes called sexually antagonistic pleiotropy. Basically, it means that most mutations are inherited. So if there's an allele which makes males more aggressive and more then winning status competitions more, but it also makes women more anxious or something, or even more aggressive, but it's not even good for them, then that allele could be selected despite it having a cost in one sex and a benefit in the other sex. With autism, you have this kind of quite clear sex difference. Now, this has been debated over time, and we've basically established, okay, right, historically, 30 years ago, everyone thought that autistic rates were something like 10 to 1 in high-functioning autism, especially, or the cases which are less associated with intellectual disability, Asperger's. it was long recognized that the more severe cases were often much closer. So these mutations, these de novo mutations I was talking about that categorize, most of the time that those are like similar rates between males and females, just because mutations can arise in both genders. It's in these sort of subtler cases which we can't explain that we historically found quite significant autism rate differences. Something like 10 to 1, even more maybe. Now, a lot of this is just psychiatric practice and people thinking, oh, autism is the male disorder. And probably what you found is that a lot of women who we would now diagnose with autism were actually previously being diagnosed with like a female-specific disorder as well. This is just basically how psychiatrists kind of go about their life. Like as soon as someone comes into you and they start telling you about their life, if they're male or female, historically, you'd be thinking much more about an autism diagnosis for the male and whatever, a borderline upper personality disorder diagnosis for the female. That has changed. We've recognized that actually, you know, there are many female cases of autism which we were missing. Perhaps they were subtler, but also they sort of manifest in slightly different ways. So if you look at the genetics of autism and families with autism, you'll find that for a female to meet an autism diagnosis, they often need more of the autism kind of predisposing alleles. So there's like a higher polygenic load that is required, a higher polygenic score. So it seems to me there's some kind of buffering or camouflaging which occurs in females, which just means that autism is slightly harder to detect. The quite nice anecdote that I've read in one paper of this was if you're in a playground and it was actually someone who was, you know, in a playground looking at autistic children and how they interacted, the autistic boy would be sort of on the corner of a playground, looking down and like playing with his shadow. The autistic girl would be sort of standing with other girls, like in a circle, but just not quite interacting in the same way, not quite so fluid, not really understanding what to say. So from the eyes of a person just kind of looking around the playground, you notice the boy over there, like being weird, playing with the shadow. Oh, that's unusual, that's a disorder. But you wouldn't notice the girl who is, you know, maybe not interacting really fluidly. This is, okay, but when you look closely, okay, you realize there are these differences. This is definitely some form of autism. It's just manifesting slightly differently. Perhaps it's cultural. I think it may be partly cultural, but there might be something biological going on here as well. You know, females in general are just slightly better empathizers and people talkers. We really need to do good cross-cultural research to see if that works out. But okay, whatever. What matters is that the autism diagnosis currently, for this sort of more, for the not intellectually disabled case of autism, you probably see like about a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 ratio of boys to girls. However, these alleles, the genes which are causing these autistic traits are still in these girls. It's just they're manifesting in a slightly different way. If you're just looking at the males who are manifesting the autism and looking in them for the adaptation, you could actually just be missing something. Like it could be the case, and this is contradictory to some of the major hypotheses in the field. You know, your intuition might be, oh, we need to explain why autism is good for males. However, it's entirely possible that the genes which are manifesting in males as diagnosable autism and in females as like slightly subtler manifestations, they could just be harming the males. Like it could just be bad for the males to be autistic in this way, but actually be good for the females. So it could just be sexually antagonistic pleiotropy, basically. Well, not basically, that's an annoying term which no one understands. But anyway, for the evolutionary biologists, that could be what it is. So this is slightly contradictory to maybe our intuitions, but it's important. Like we can, by thinking about sex differences and realizing that the thing that we want to be explaining is not just the trait in this particular gender, it's not just the eating disorders in the women, it's like, what is that tendency doing across men and women? Like, you can just have these random offshoots of harmful stuff manifesting in one sex more than the other for all sorts of reasons. Maybe it is cultural. But the thing you want to be explaining is the heritable component manifesting between both sexes, okay? So for autism, we do actually need to think about these female cases more. Like, the evolutionary explanation should recognize however female autism is manifesting could actually be key to its adaptive explanation. Okay, so in this case, unlike duration and age of effect, this is like a visibility element which is missing from the original diagnostic criteria. So what do? We expand it. We say, okay, we're going to look at the female cases, even though they might be somewhat subclinical and not be meeting the disorder diagnosis. Great. That's sex out of the way. We've got prevalence and environmental factors to think about next. Prevalence, I mean, I've sort of talked about this already, and it's quite obvious, right? Basically, if you're diagnosing the 1% or the 2% as autistic, and okay, they don't have any obviously categorizable disease, but you could very well be, and indeed in the case of autism are, missing a whole spectrum of traits. Basically, you've started with this social impetus to identify the people who are suffering the most. This 1% of people who really, can't integrate and can't get jobs or whatever it is. You've defined your diagnostic criteria in a way to pick out the most harmed cases, often at the extreme. This is like a fact that happens across basically all of psychiatry, all at least of the kind of the stable personality trait stuff. The psychopathy, the schizophrenia, neuroticism, which then manifests as like extreme anxiety and depression. Arguably even eating disorders being the most conscientious people. This is a huge, huge thing, which I think should be, is of all of these visibility variables, this is probably the one that most needs to happen or most needs to be recognized if you want to start trying to give an adaptive explanation for something. Thinking about it at like a wider population scale where it's not just this individual who's manifesting this quite extreme trait that we're diagnosing as harmful, but it's the spectrum, basically. Everything has a spectrum. Every trait is on a spectrum. This is, again, is like one of the major reasons why evolutionary principles are important for justifying expanding the spectrum, but also showing why the biomedicine could have just been going completely wrong in its attempts to, for instance, find the genes or the brain basis for mental disorder. Because if what you do is you take this 1% of people and you put them in a brain scanner, and then you take people from the 99%, but you haven't tested how autistic those people are, then you could end up comparing people who are like actually kind of almost like diagnosably autistic to people who are just about like diagnosably autistic. So basically very similar traits, put them in a brain scanner, and then also put in another person who's like not at all autistic. And then you try and like find the differences in their brains. Well, you've just done something really messy. You've picked your sample wrong. You should have really been trying to like treat these traits as quantitative, as you call it, like how much of an autism score do you have? Not that this really fixes neuroscience. People have tried to do this a bit, and neuroscience is messy in all sorts of ways, which don't make this like the perfect solution. But it is definitely a necessary part of the solution. And yes, for evolutionary explanations, what we do need to do is recognize the spectrum, basically, for everything like okay, you might be manifesting this like slightly extreme trait, but you need to, we need to think about people who are maybe more mild. Okay, so, I mean, the obvious way to do that is just increasing prevalence rates. How much do you have to increase it? Where is a trait like so invisible that you really don't even really need, like an evolutionary explanation is completely implausible versus where it becomes actually quite plausible? Well, to go back to something I mentioned earlier, the way to frame prevalence is in terms of the social group that you're interacting with. The if a trait is rarer than like 0.7%, 0.6% of people, then it wouldn't have existed in every social group. So it basically couldn't be adaptive. There are very few adaptations, depending on how you interact, plasticity and whatever, but like there's complexities. But basically, in general, more common is good. Below 1% is sort of on the, like far below 1% just couldn't be adaptive, probably. If you're kind of at the 1 to 2 to 3% range, you're at a level where every single social group would have known someone for ancestral history, assuming that they manifest in the same way, which we'll come on to next. Then, yeah, every single social group would have probably had someone or a couple of people who have that trait. Then it becomes possibly adaptive. But also, you need to start thinking about, like, well, are there 5% of people who express that trait in like a slightly more mild way? When you get the person with autism, what about their family members? Are their family members doing okay? Are they doing well? The trait is more visible in those subclinical people. If there is say you have hundreds of genes that cause autism in the population, cause autistic traits in the population, and a lot of people are sort of bouncing around with, like moderate amounts and actually doing quite well, and say that's like 5 to 10% of people, but then 1% of people have like a particular mix of these genes, which then like maybe go a little bit too far, or like there was some weird environment that interacted with them, which caused them to have like slightly more social disability. You also need to be thinking about these like 10% as well as that 1%, right? The thing that evolution cares about is really how are the traits doing across the whole spectrum? And we'll get into this a little bit later as to what this means for explaining autism in particular. It's basically plausible that, there are many different versions of this hypothesis, but it could be that the 1% is good, could be that the 10% is good, could actually mix between generations, like maybe for 100 years, it was actually good to be on the spectrum. And then for another 50 years, a person who was like genuinely, hitting the diagnostic criteria could benefit. Evolution doesn't really matter. It's all about, there's all this nuance and complexity, and different generations have different things happening to them. Anyway, point is, with prevalence, thinking about visibility, what is the more visible correlate? Okay. Finally, environmental factors. So with autism, yeah, we have to integrate more of the female cases, and we have to integrate more of the spectrum. These are the two main takeaways so far. Age of effect and duration doesn't really matter. But if you want to be explaining it something adaptive, you want to be looking at these two variables and expanding this kind of criteria somewhat. Okay. Then we have environmental factors. So the way in which environmental visibility can be conceived is when you have this heritable component that is manifesting in, let's not take autism, let's take eating disorders. Okay, you see that eating disorders are somewhat heritable. It's quite likely that if a parent had an eating disorder, their kid will have an eating disorder, or cousins will, or whatever. You see it runs in families. Then so then the question is that the thing I need to be explaining? Is that eating disorder the thing I need to be explaining? Assuming that it's also hitting all the other visibility criteria as well. It's like early onset, long enough duration, high enough prevalence. The problem is that new environments can cause the same heritable factor, or modern environments, let's say, can cause the same heritable factor to manifest in very different traits. So this happens with eating disorders. It seems that if you're in an environment where like you're not exposed to Western beauty norms, and you're not in the context of like very highly calorific food, people just don't have eating disorders. It's one of those diagnoses which we look at as very kind of culturally bound, and is now actually spreading. And you see, especially in Asia, there were cases where there were no eating disorders, and then they suddenly arose once they kind of got incepted in, basically. So here you have to, what's the thing that evolution should be trying to explain? It's not the eating disorder, it's the thing underlying it, which now manifests in eating disorder in our own society or in our own context. But actually, there were probably no eating disorders amongst hunter-gatherers. And actually, I've known anthropologists who've gone to hunter-gatherers, ask questions about, like, is there anyone who doesn't eat, much food? And they kind of like look at you blank and confused, because like the whole point of life is basically hunting food, feasting. It's like unthinkable to them that, that you would just not eat for any reason. So, okay, so what you really want to understand, so what evolutionary theory should be trying to understand and explain is not the eating disorder, it's the thing underneath it, because there's still a heritable component here, right? Like, you have to explain why some people are just way more likely to develop eating disorders than others. And I mean, I'm not going to get into this here, but basically what you can see is, by also using the other visibility variables, you can expand and say, oh, well, what's the more common component behind this that's early in life and kind of affects you? And you'll probably find something like conscientiousness, this personality trait, which makes you very hardworking and perfectionist. See that there's a very strong correlation with having that personality trait and manifesting an eating disorder in a certain society. And if you look across societies, you look cross-culturally, you can probably find conscientiousness, this perfectionism, manifesting in all sorts of different ways. So that is the heritable thing that you want to be explaining. It's the thing that is manifesting across cultures, basically invariantly, or it can be varying, but is like, it depends on the culture it arises in as to what happens. And in some cases, it might go too far down this calorie restriction route or whatever and cause an eating disorder. Okay, so you need this. So this is the final level of integration, thinking cross-culturally. Did this trait manifest? Basically, what you want to think is, like, did this trait manifest for our hunter-gatherer ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years? We can't really do that, but we can look cross-culturally and say, okay, well, this does or doesn't arise. With something like obesity, you would see, oh, well, actually, we couldn't really ever get fat. So the reason that you might find that, there's this heritable persistence, this heritable tendency to become obese, it's not because becoming obese was ever good. It's just because the thing that was inherited never manifested in current society. So this talks to a lot of what evolutionary psychiatrists think about a lot, which is like mismatch. The concept that modern environments are causing certain disorders. And in the D-side framework, to start thinking about like what the inherited thing is that will then manifest in disorder today, we push you towards thinking about cross-cultural manifestations, basically. Okay, this is also, interestingly, like a piece of evidence which is really lacking in the literature and is quite hard to find for various reasons, because it is actually hard to study mental disorders cross-culturally, as I know from colleagues trying to do this right now in Cambridge. And so this is really messy, but at least it's necessary. Like, and it's also one of the sad things, just to take a slight diversion, because it looks like I'm going on for a few hours here. Apologies for that. Okay, so this is an area of evidence that is actually disappearing from our world at a kind of an alarming rate and could genuinely shut off for the rest of human history, no matter how long we survive, no matter how many thousands or millions of years. I mean, I'm an optimist, but the species survives, we will never be able to replay this experiment of like living in, well, the natural, the real world of us living in these different cultural environments, like living like hunter-gatherers. This is, I think, more than any other area of science, this should be the biggest justification for just investing in just studying humans, not just like how are people living. Okay, everyone that we meet will probably be starting to have electricity and smartphones and clothes and stuff, but let's just at least capture that information in such a different cultural context and study it and just have it as data to go over for the thousands of years ahead of us. Because if we don't have it, we will never know. It will just be conjecture. It will just be going through these old resources, which already is kind of the best way that we can. But anyway, it's really sad. It's frankly slightly horrifying. As a person who loves truth and wants to understand things, the idea that we will lose this evidence forever, and it could be, Yeah, and it could be the key, could really be the key to solving the problems of like understanding what mental health is. Anyway, on a happier note, we can use this evidence to make inferences and to increase the to integrate the traits which might really need evolutionary explanation. That is what we will. Yeah, that has incredible promise. So for something like autism, there's actually really bad evidence as to what autism, how autism manifests across cultures. However, it is, it's assumed and seems to at least arise in some way. I'll get into some details in a little bit about nuances of manifestation, which might be really important for understanding why autism exists. However, yeah, it does, in general, autism probably arises cross-culturally. We don't have to kind of think, oh, well, what is autism like outside in like a completely different way. In the same way that eating disorders are quite unusual, this very weird manifestation of this trait, which may be just like some perfectionism. But we don't need to kind of completely change how we're diagnosing autism to just start thinking about what evolutionary explanations of autism might be. Okay, so we've got through the third stage. We've completed basically the most important task that evolutionary psychiatry and medicine really need to complete, which is honing in on the correct objective explanation. And I cannot emphasize enough how much this has been a problem. I mean, most of you, I suppose, will know something about this, but it's been such a problem in psychiatry to know like what you should be explaining. This question of where do you draw the line of the spectrum of autism, and is 1% of autistics the right level, or 4%, or whatever. None of these scientific paradigms can ever really hope to have the strength and the theoretical soundness and just objective reliability of the evolutionary paradigm, because this is really nicely theory derived. And this is where I get kind of excited, because it's so beautiful and pure. It's so like based in this like fundamental theory of natural selection, which is really simple. And just extrapolating it out to these variables that we can look at of every single individual or biological state or trait, and say, okay, well, what is the thing that is visible? And knowing that how natural selection works, like where can the adaptation be? This is really how you do solve, hopefully to some extent, not so much in a clinical sense, but definitely in a scientific sense, how you solve like the thing we should be trying to explain is through integration. Once we've categorized out the cases that we don't need to think about, which are like pathologies, which were sort of accidentally being clustered. That's the point of this first stage of the DCIDE framework. Now, the really cool thing about this as well is that once you've integrated these traits, then you have a really, like, assuming that it works and that you can find earlier correlates and the traits that existed for a long time or had a significant effect on, the time when you could have been being reproductively successful. This is pushing what is called in the literature the paradox of common harmful heritable mental disorders, put forward by Matt Keller and Jeffrey Miller in 2006. So the idea is there's this paradox, right? I talk about it all the time, talked about it earlier. The paradox is, why are these things heritable and haven't been pushed out despite being harmful? So once you've integrated, you've taken all these areas of evidence and you've really made this paradox absolutely ridiculously paradoxical, because the thing that you come out with is, okay, it's heritable and doesn't seem to be explained by pathology. That's what categorization basically does. We also know that it's common enough to have existed in every tribe, probably in quite a significant number of individuals. So like most of our ancestors would have known people with these traits. Okay. It's also early onset enough, and this is something that Keller and Miller missed, but like early onset traits are really paradoxical. Why on earth would a disease that's heritable just arrive early in life? You're meant to be doing everything in your youth. You're 14 and you're manifesting some weird inherited mental disorder that's like, what? You're meant to be peak success. You're meant to be trying everything to try and like integrate and become like reproductively successful. Disease should not manifest at that age. Anyway, so early onset. The duration, like it's long enough. It's manifesting for a long enough time that it is kind of significantly affecting your potential for reproductive success. Right, so the prevalence is high enough, and yes, environmentally, the traits are manifesting kind of cross-culturally. Like we identify the cross-culturally invariant sort of fundamental thing. It's not just some offshoot of modernity or some like cause of something caused by evolutionary mismatch. And you're also looking at the traits between the sexes, and there's these the trait is manifesting between the sexes in this interesting way. So these are all elements that basically add up to maximize the paradox of why these traits would persist. And this is such a huge theoretical strength to then go into attempting evolutionary explanations with, because note that every single explanation, whether it's whatever, microbiome or trauma-based or like, it's some dysfunction of cognition in some way, every explanation should be trying to explain these facts, which is super paradoxical. Like if you're just trying to say it's some simple disease, why is it a simple disease, which is so early onset and duration and blah, 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 and prevalence and across the sexes and expressing across environments? This is the real paradox. This is huge. Like if there is a disease that explains this, which is not impossible, it's possible. It's maybe possible. There are ways in which, mutations can avoid selection and cause traits which look like this. Maybe. But the point is, like, this is really, really justifying trying to think about evolutionary explanations. And at this stage, we're pretty damn sure that we are looking at the cluster of individuals where there could be an adaptive process.
The Evolving Psychiatry Podcast is financially supported by the Human Ecology Group of the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich.